I'm Steven, and today I'll be talking a little bit about how I verify that a font's naming is probably going to work well. This is a surprisingly complex topic. Um, there's like a lot of opportunities to go wrong here, but there are a few strategies you can use to hopefully get as many things right as possible. So, what do I mean by the font name? Well, at a very basic sense, a font name is just a font name. And it can be hard to figure out the font name. Like, that's a creative decision that is just challenging to really nail down, partly because there are so many font names already used, and it's not a good practice to use a font name that's already been used, because if somebody has that font on their computer already, even if it's a pretty rare font from the font or something, um, there will be a conflict between their font and your font, quite likely. So it's kind of a bummer. But so the first thing I do actually to know that I have an okay unique font name is like font name check. Um, so there's a top hit here, which is the thing. Looks like I was previously searching for the font name meme, and there's already a font named meme. But you can search for anything. So, like coffee cup. I don't know. Um, Takes a minute. It has a big database from like my fonts and Duff font and various ones. So nobody's called the font coffee cup before. It's up for grabs if you feel like that's perfect for your project. But okay, so that's kind of the creative side of it. Where things start to get a little more technical, and what I'm going to be talking about right now is finding ways to avoid problems in software and operating systems with the font names that you use, and specifically the font name data that winds up in your built fonts. That's kind of like a Galaxy Brain version of all this. The the like okay, so Glyphs app has a pretty good article about some of these basic limitations. Oh, not here. Here. Let's see. So, I don't know. You can search for their website, and this is what comes to mind immediately when I think of font naming things to look out for. Basically, okay, here we go, the naming tutorial. You want to keep your font name fairly short because the style names have to be short, because there's a specific font name for, like, I think PostScript documents, like PDFs. They say you are on the safe side if it does not exceed 20 characters. That's on the low end. I've typically heard it said as 31 characters, but that is the full name with like the font name, so like Chantel Sands or Recursive or Helvetica, um, plus the style name like condensed bold or casual extra bold, etc. So yeah, it's worth reading about this. It seems like a lot of information, but it's all important to making a font work really well. Further, if you want to really get into things and know about it, there's the OpenType Spec. This is a specification for fonts, sort of like there's a USB specification and an HDMI specification and a HTML specification. All of these modern technologies that like a lot of companies have to agree on have a spec, so that the software makers, the operating system makers, hardware makers can all look at this thing and say, okay, here's what we officially have to support to say that we support OpenType. And there's, disparities, of course, but essentially, this is really interesting. Like, I didn't know about this for the longest time, but there's some really great stuff to read here, to really understand at a deeper level what a font is, what a digital font is, or an OpenType font. And the high level thing is that a font is a bunch of tables, including a name table. So you can go and read this information if you really want to know what a name table is. And this is the really critical part here, the name IDs. So, for instance, this is all pretty abstract, but let's actually pop open a font. So, let's find my terminal window. Nope, not that. I don't have it open yet. Okay, let's find my Finder window here. This is the Chantel Sands project folder, and let me pop open a terminal window. Okay, and then I can navigate to this folder, type repos, Chantel Sands, and I'm not going to be going into how to use a terminal, but essentially CD is for change directory, and then you can just type out or copy out and paste the name of the directory you want to go to. And ls lists the files in here. And if I wanted to actually see what like tables are in my font, there's a really nice tool called TTX. And let me check that it's installed right now. Cool. So TTX, if I want to see just the name table of a font, I can say -t, type out the table name, which is name, and then this is, by default, it will create a file that's really long. Let me just show that actually. So let me find a font as an example. There's a lot of static instances here, but I'll find the normal regular. I'll do Option Command C to copy the path of it, and then paste that. And there is a space here, so actually what I'll need to do is also darn it, wrap it in quote marks so that it doesn't take it as separate commands. So yeah, if I say TTX and then a font path, it says dumping all these tables, and then I can look at this. All right, let's drag it into VS Code, my code editor. And this is a very long XML file. It converts all of the binary information in that font, digital font file, into tables that are easy enough or possible for a human to read. So there's like, oh, this is an OpenType font, which records path data in the CFF format, typically, or rather, it's a CFF flavored OpenType font, which means that the Bezier curves have a cubic structure that looks like the pen tool you're probably used to drawing with if you draw fonts. There's also TTF flavored OpenType fonts, which use a slightly different path construction. Anyway, so the CFF table isn't particularly human readable, which is why some people don't like it as much, or one of the reasons. Let's do like a search for the name table. Okay, so here is the name table, and this is what you will see if you look at the name table of, or it's similar to what you'll see for a name table of a font. So this includes information like the version number, the postscript name, which is kind of the name used in the name ID 6, is the name recorded for like a PDF. Yeah, just various software will use different names here. So like, I think, for instance, generally speaking, like Mac software will say this name ID 1 in like the font family menu, and then this in the font style menu. Microsoft Word, meanwhile, like has just one menu, so it might combine things like this sometimes. Or yeah, there's like different. I may not be totally accurate here. There's different ways to do it. And then, for instance, there's like the name of the manufacturer and the designer or designers and links to those people, names for stylistic sets, for instance, if they have names, or in a variable font, there will be names for each of the instances within the family. Yeah. And then there's other data tables like the CMap maps each glyph name to the Unicode value, which is like one of the main things that makes a font work for typing at all. So that was kind of a deep dive. Something I like to do is if we tap up, we can go back to the previous thing. And actually, we can simplify this by, we're already in this directory or folder, so we can simplify by just giving the relative path. And then, all right, another secret about the terminal is if you go to preferences, terminal preferences or command, comma, you can change the cursor to a vertical bar, which is a lot easier for most people to just understand, including myself. All right, so I can also just say -t space name to get the name table, and then I can do -o-, which I think of like maybe as a yawning emoji or something. It means like output none, which just means that it doesn't create a file with a TTX extension, but rather prints it directly out. So this is a nice way to basically test things quickly or check things quickly if you're just wondering about like a specific name ID. All right, so let's delete this TTX file so it's not hanging around. And let me show, for instance, how a font family name will go into an exported font file. So let's just add test name. And I'll revert this change later, but if I just export straight from glyphs, let's give this a different location. Yeah, just keep it nice and obvious. Okay. And okay. Fingers crossed it all works. I think it will, but this is a complex project, so there might be something that doesn't. Okay. All right. It seems like that worked. All right. Cool. Our test folder is here. So let's check out the name table. Oops. Test. Let's make sure to put it in quotes. You can put tab to sort of autocomplete, which is pretty handy when you're typing out paths. So let's just say regular. Okay. So it spits it out. And we can see that, for instance, our basic family name now has our new name. So rather than Chantel Sands, it's test name. And then that gets placed in a lot of these other spots where the family name is. And you can see this all if you go in here into the OpenType Spec. You can see, for instance, that code 1 is the basic font family name. Code 2 is the basic font subfamily name. There's a lot of, this gets kind of complex, like if you want to get the style linking right. And yeah, so like the font subfamily name, interestingly, is the main thing that handles the style linking. So if you hit Command B in Microsoft Word or other programs, it knows what the bold version is. And basically that means that the font subfamily name can only be RIBI, regular, italic, bold, or bold italic. And then the font family name, let's test this in a better way. So rather than looking at regular, let's look at medium. Oops. Oh, that's not That's not an instance from the basic thing. It's generated from... All right, let's look at middle and see what glyphs does. I think it'll be right, but I'm not positive about that. Okay, here's a really good example where the font family name now becomes test name middle, which is just the instance name regular, which just means like it's not the bold of anything. It is kind of one of those more fancy style. But then there will also be something for Adobe apps or smarter apps where there's the preferred family name 16 and then the actual style name 17. And you can also check this in here. So the typographic family name and typographic subfamily name. So basically programs that typographers would use or graphic designers would use will use these things, or programs with two fonts, one for family, one for style, will use these, whereas programs with one menu will only use this as the family name and then just relies on style linking. So how do we know if we have issues in a font? This is the main way to check it out. Well, there's something called FontBakery, because this is a lot of information to learn. So it's actually really helpful to have a way to kind of check your work and then find and fix issues from there. So FontBakery is an open source tool sponsored primarily by Google Fonts, but it has contributors from a lot of places like Adobe and Type Bureau and Type Network and stuff. So to install FontBakery, well, there's a whole introduction that's probably a better introduction in the documentation of FontBakery. And I think there's installation introductions or guides for, Linux versus Mac versus Windows. If you're using glyphs, you have to be on Mac. So, if you haven't done this before, python.org is where you can download Python. I believe that is required. So if you just go to download, you can just, download the latest version. That does a package thing. You install it like any other app you would install from the internet, and then you can start using it. And the way you can tell that you have it is when you open a command line, you can say Python -- version, and it will tell you the basic version for that Python. Python has sort of version 2 and version 3. So if you say Python 3 version, then it tells you the latest version you have. And I believe I'm pretty much almost on the latest version, so I should be okay. I could install 0.6 if I really wanted to, but I typically update versions when I start having problems related to versioning. Or problems that I don't understand, which might be related to versioning. So let's see. Since I have Python, I can then do Python 3. I want to create... Sorry, let me introduce this. I want to install FontBakery in this project, but keep it specific to this project so that if I do another project in 3 months, I can still go back and use the right version of dependencies in this project, but then I may have other versions of dependencies in that project. So there's this whole concept called a virtual environment, which is very useful. You don't need to know all about it, but basically, here's how to make one. When you're in a folder, like a project folder, you say Python 3-m, which stands for module. Venv is the short name. And then most people, you could call this module folder anything you want to. Most people say venv. You could also say virtual environment or whatever. But Ven for short is really good. It's kind of a convention. So then let's look at Finder. And if we look, we now have a Venv folder. And this kind of copies the specific version of Python and then has spaces to install programs. So we say pip install, oops, skipped a step. Because this is a subset of your Python environment for this specific project, you actually have to get into it. And you do that by saying source venv bin activate. And now your terminal should give you parentheses saying the virtual environment name. So now I can say pip install FontBakery. And that will install FontBakery in this virtual environment. And so I do have to activate the virtual environment to use FontBakery. You can install things like FontBakery globally, but I've just always run into problems if I depend too much on global installations of things. So I keep my global installations very basic. Basically just TTX is one of the few global things. Oh, all right. This has been happening lately. It's an error encountered while trying to install a package. And if you look, it says it's an architecture not supported. So this is kind of an example of a scary error, but you can take these errors and Google around for them, or if you go to the FontBakery GitHub, you can file an issue. Well, you should search for an issue first, and if it's there, there might be the solution. If it's not there, you can ask a question. And Felipe Sanchez is the main maintainer of FontBakery. He's very responsive and helpful. LXML. Let's see if this will run. I just have to find the this is pretty deep. I did find the specific solution and document it on FontBakery, I think. So, okay, here's the workaround. Copy this, and this is basically a little way to tell your computer that you're running an Intel Mac. If you're on an M1 Mac, I believe that you won't have this error, but I'm still on an Intel Mac. So we give this architecture flag to say, hey, I'm on an Intel x86 64-bit, and then we do this pip install FontBakery. And it will hopefully work. Let's see. Takes a while. And I'm making a mental note to go and read a bit more about this. In fact, maybe, geez, it does take a long time. This video is really getting in the weeds. Love it. In fact, actually, somebody else seems to maybe... It's hard to say. It seems like they have the issue on an M1 Mac, so maybe everybody's having this issue. Looks like this is another solution. Well, it works with the arc flags. It probably also works with this. In fact, let me test it just to see. Okay, that seems to also work. I don't know what the better solution is right now, but that's not really the point of this video. If you're looking at this video in a few weeks, hopefully this will be solved by then. If not, this is at least an introduction of the GitHub Issues system and how when you're kind of at the cutting edge of building fonts and testing them out, you gain a lot of advantages, and I believe that it's really worth doing. But there are things you have to learn, kind of, and that's a bit of a tricky thing. But those things that you learn will benefit you in other areas too. GitHub is really neat, and it's like one of the best things about the internet today. All right, so where are we at? Now we can use FontBakery. So to use a command line tool, you can say FontBakery. What's the best way for me to do this in a video? Maybe I'll make my terminal quite a bit bigger. That's probably better. FontBakery -- help. This is kind of the first thing I reach for when I'm trying to use a command line tool. You say the name of the tool, and then -- help will usually give you documentation. In this case, there's a few things, but there are subcommands here, which are the important part. You could either list the subcommands, or I'm noticing it lists them already. But let's do this just to show how a flag works. I mean, the -- help is already a flag. List subcommands, cool. So these subcommands are basically profiles of checks that different organizations want to run on fonts before they onboard them. So for instance, Google Fonts has various checks that it wants to do to make sure fonts meet their expectations. So this will, for instance, check for an open font license in the project root, because all fonts on Google Fonts are OFL licensed for the most part, or open source licensed. Adobe Fonts has their own checks, and those, I believe, are checks to ensure that things will meet the standards at Adobe Fonts. And then there's a check universal, which is also a good one if you're making fonts just, say, for retail, not intending to put them necessarily on Google Fonts or Adobe Fonts. So let's start with that one. FontBakery, you say check universal, that's the subcommand, and then you give it the font name. And this has no spaces in it, but I usually try to wrap things in quote marks because sometimes there are spaces that I don't think about. Or sometimes there are other symbols that will mess with a command line. So like a square bracket in a font name, you need to have the path name wrapped in quotes, or the square bracket will trip things up. So, all right. So this is the output of FontBakery. It may seem like a lot, but it's not too bad. There's also an option to output a GitHub Markdown file, which you can put into a GitHub issue or similar, and it will create a nice little checklist kind of with emoji and such that can be helpful. So yeah, FontBakery will kind of run a set of checks and tell you whether your font is likely to work or not in various ways. So this is telling me right off the bat that my win ascent and win descent are not the values expected. And if you haven't deliberately set these to values you care about, you should pay attention, and this is generally good advice. I believe that these values, for my purposes, are important. The trade-off is that some accents will sometimes get cut off, but not too badly on top. And this is useful to have the line heights that I want. So there's also a lot of other checks. This is all to say, FontBakery is usually right, but not always right. So it's just helpful to know what you want. The other checks here are, does the font have all the required tables? It gives an info result and tells me that I've got various optional tables. And it seems that it has all the required tables. Otherwise, it would be a fail. Yeah. This is a really interesting warning, actually. That these glyph names can't be reached with code point or substitution rules. And this is because my full build process actually adds in more font features, but I do really want to check on this again after the video because I'm moving the features into Glyphs app, and this would be really good to just double check that they're winding up in the actual fonts. Then again, I'm not getting this warn, I believe, in the FontBakery checks on my actual font, so I think it is fine. And then it'll tell you things like these glyphs don't have the expected Y coordinates, and this is a marker style font, so there's quite a bit of subtle variation of things, but a lot of the times these are saying like, well, this is actually really interesting. This particular O has a Y point that is 1 unit below the X height, so that sort of thing, that might actually be a problem. Somehow I copy and pasted that below or something. Yeah. So it gives you a variety of warnings about the data inside the font and the curves or okay, that won't do anything. Okay. Yeah, the Bezier curves and the overall, it tries to check the overall quality of the font. If let's make this more interesting. Let's give it a super long name. And it should warn us. It should warn us that this is going to be too many characters. So let's find out. Because there's that limit around 31 or 20, depending who you ask. So let's try it again. Click up arrow to get back to our previous command. And let's see if it gives us another warn. It probably will. It should. Unless maybe our... It almost seems like our test name... Oh. Let me actually list the... Or just look in Finder. Oh, okay. We were still checking the old one with that path. So, yeah. Let's Command C to get that. FontBakery. I'm hoping to produce an extra warn or fail here. Let's see. I'm actually really surprised that it's not. Unless I haven't found it yet. that's really interesting. I would definitely expect that to trigger some more warnings. Maybe the Google Fonts test will give another fail. Let me Command F to see if I can search for name in here. Maybe I think this is searching from the top. Okay. Oh. Well, that doesn't help because my file name has the name in it. Ha. Okay, here we go. This is the kind of thing I'm looking for. Family max length. The combined length of the family and style exceeds 27 characters. And you can go and read more about this issue if you want to understand it better, because there's lots of different sources that were used to get to 27. I believe the result comes from either like an old version of Windows Explorer or a PDF spec or something that says that 27 is the cap. So, yeah, that is an example of why maybe you shouldn't just stop at the universal checks, but you should also run through, say, the Google fonts or the Adobe fonts or other checks to kind of have extra certainty that a name is correct. And of course, and see if there's other failures that you want to fix. Some of the fails, like there are 8 fails here, so a lot of those would just be about the license or various other things in the folder, like not having the expected structure. So yeah, you just kind of have to use this tool, but realize that not every piece of information it gives you is necessarily relevant to your project. But it is really helpful to have a tool like this to check on your thing, and you could even integrate this into, say, a font build shell script or makefile or Python script if you get more advanced with it, to sort of automatically check on the results of every build. And that way, if you make a change, you can be more confident that the change doesn't break anything. That's why this tool exists in the first place, because places like Google Fonts or Adobe Fonts really need to be certain that they're not publishing a regression for a font update to their service, because they don't want people using that font to suddenly have the font broken in their Google Docs or on their websites and whatnot. And if you're selling fonts to users, you probably don't want that either. So FontBakery is pretty awesome. It doesn't do everything, and it's still a work in progress. So like I said, the issues can be useful, and you should also manually test your fonts in places that you really need them to work. So I end up using my fonts a lot in Adobe InDesign and Illustrator, and if they're not working there, I realize that I probably have to do some more research and more testing and maybe some font fixes. Maybe I'll run FontBakery to see if that will help me catch anything. Microsoft Word is like famously difficult to fully support with a font, and they themselves don't they like have language in various places saying that they don't support custom fonts. Basically, they only guarantee things to work for fonts on Windows. If you're selling font licenses, that may or may not be a big concern to you, depending what your fonts, what you expect your fonts to be used for. Yeah, some places like Heffler & Co. sold like specific fonts for Office users or something, which I believe were engineered specifically to work in tools like Microsoft Word and PowerPoint, where people only really need the 4 styles per font, And maybe that would be useful for a huge organization where you've got a lot of kind of users who aren't necessarily typographers using a certain font family. But that is a lot already about making fonts and checking the naming information and the other metadata inside the font. So hopefully that is informative. If you were looking for a guide that is simpler than the glyphs tutorial on naming, I'm sorry, this wasn't it. It's a fairly complex topic, and so there's a bit of a complex solution for that thing. It's a lot harder than you might expect it to be, but yeah, a lot of good things and a lot of worthwhile things are. So best of luck out there. If you've got a question, let me know. I'll try to look at the comments, or I'm on Instagram and Twitter and email and things. So yeah, best of luck if you're making a font, and best of luck if you're learning about font engineering. It's pretty overwhelming at first, but it, you know, has its fun parts and is definitely rewarding. So yeah, enjoy.